The exclusive right to sell listing agreement for residential properties. This is the form. Where do we find it? When we're back in Instanet, which is where we find when we log in, clicking Instanet, we pull up and see our form section. Go to seller, and then you scroll right on down to listing agreements, and you see exclusive seller agency. This is where you're going to represent the seller as the seller's agent. If you were going to be a transaction broker in the deal or operate more neutral, it would be doing this transaction broker form. But we're going to go seller agency, as that is what most listing agreements are going to be in a residential deal. Now again, for these videos, we go over where the blank spaces are and give you some tips and pointers on what to think of and use for when working with your sellers. Here at the top, our first our first blank space is referring to the property. So we want to put in the property address in this first blank. Next is talking about the period of the listing agreement, beginning at a certain date, ending on a certain date. For a residential listing agreement, we typically see this at about 6 months. Reason being, it gives you time to list the property, and if for some reason the deal falls through, it gives you a chance to continue to try to get another deal. And also, when things are just moving slower, it gives you time to make sure it's worth your effort. Now, we explain this one to sellers, especially in a hot buyer's market. The 6 months might seem like a long time, but a typical transaction from listing day to close will take about 3 months. If you think about it, the first month, we get the property up, we're marketing it, we ideally get an offer, and then it takes 30 to 60 days to close on the home. So it can be a 60 to 90 day process at its fastest. We always like to ask for a 6-month listing agreement because in case the deal falls through on that first one, if it occurs, we want a shot to get another deal. Or if the market just slows down dramatically, 6 months is about the time frame it can take to sell the home. It takes 2-3 months to get a contract. Then it takes another 30 to 60 days to close. That's our common statements for trying to make sure they're comfortable with a 6-month period. But again, we've seen folks do them as short as a few weeks and as long as a year or so. But the goal being about the 6-month range. Legal description, you can get that from Realist. Watch our Realist video for logging in the MLS, and you can put the parcel ID in there or the actual legal description that's noted on Realist. You can also get them from the county records, which is what Realist pulls from. Next is the purchase price. So we put the dollar figure in here and then type out the name here, or how you would say it. So $100,000, $100,000. And this is also where if you're using Instanet, it helps put some of these numbers and statements in. Next part is what terms are willing to accept for that purchase price. This is all setting expectations for you on what you can and cannot accept or want to market for. Cash is generally always acceptable, so you're typically always going to have a check mark there. The loan is typically as well acceptable, it's just what type. Conventional loan, that's generally your cleanest type. Most folks are comfortable with that. FHA, VA, most folks are very acceptable with that, but you as a listing agent need to be aware of, hey, will this home possibly have any issues with an FHA or VA loan? If you cannot live in the home, generally FHA or VA might struggle with it unless it's a certain type of FHA or VA loan. If it also has it's an older home and has a lot of nicks, knacks, broken windows, peeling paint, it could be a little bit of a struggle. Things that you need to just figure out and learn, be aware, and we're going to have more trainings on it. We have more trainings on that as well. But most often, your typical residential single-family home, conventional, FHA, and VA are okay. An assumption is a little different. That's making sure, hey, seller, would you be okay with the buyer assuming your loan? Most cases, that's not going to be something the sellers are comfortable with just because it can sometimes distort their ability to go out and purchase a home. But if they say, okay, yes, we are, like some FHA and VA loans are easily assumable, they might say yes to that. Seller carry. This is one where we don't typically see it on regular residential home sales, maybe sometimes investor sales, but I'll give an example of where it might be used. And remember, if none of these are used, just put the N/A for non-applicable. We never want to leave a blank. So for the seller carry, where it might work is if you have a couple who is moving to a retirement home, let's say, and they have no mortgage on their current home and they're selling it, and they might be willing to say, hey, we're willing to offer a buyer our home and we'll carry the financing. And this is where you'd put some basic parts of that term in there. Willing to carry at 6% for 10 years and then a balloon payment, or 6 years with a 30-year amortization for up to 5 years. Whatever it is, but you put the basics of those terms in here so you're aware of it and you can help market the property. Again, more commonly or not, you won't have those filled in though. Coming down here, sale price of the property shall exclude the following. This is where you put any major items that you see with the property that they're going to be taken with it, that you might assume would stay with it, but they're like, we're taking it with us. The massive propane tank that's holding all the propane for the home, we're going to take all that kind of stuff. But if it's going to be like your fridge and range and stuff, that will also go on the residential property disclosure. Coming down below, we're going to see how we're offering our compensation and who we can work with as agents. Again, setting the stage for us knowing how we can market. We ideally want to be able to work with buyer's agents, transaction brokers, and we also want to be able to offer them compensation. Because remember how we often are paid, and we pay for real estate agents, is that the seller will commonly pay for the commissions, and then we can offer some of that to buyer's agents or transaction brokers to help broaden our market for bringing buyers to the deal. So if they mark yes to cooperation for both of these, that means we can work with them. If compensation, it means we can pay them out of the compensation we're paid for listing the home, which we'll talk about in a second. These next two sections show what we agree to do to help market their property and what we're legally bound to. Next statement shows that we're not responsible for vandalism or theft. That helps protect us. Next is that the seller agrees what they agree to give us, essentially honest information in time and manner. Now remember this as well. Listing agreements are between the brokerage and the seller, not the agent and the seller directly. The agent will be, as we talk about here in a second, a designated seller's agent representing the brokerage. So when all the documents say signature of broker, it is the brokerage itself, Hearthstone Realty, and it can be myself for the signature. Next is the earnest money, discussing that. One unique thing for our contracts is that we have that the brokerage can keep half of the earnest money, and then that the seller could get half of it if it is sent to the seller. Let's say, for example, there's a deal and it falls through at the last minute. There was $5,000 of earnest money, and the seller decides, well, we just don't want to sell anymore. The brokerage has the right to receive half of that earnest money so that it essentially helps cover some of the costs that we have taken to work on the property for the however long it had been. And this just outlines exactly that. If there's a sale of property, though, that exceeds fee, we make sure we can't take that fee. For compensation, this is where we talk about how much we're being paid. Seller agrees to pay a percentage or a dollar amount. In most cases, you're going to go with percentage and put an NA or 0 in the fee amount. Typical percentage for a residential listing is going to be between 5 and 7%. You just gauge how much work you have to put into the deal. Most of our listing agreements end up with the 6% ballpark. Next piece down here, the next blank, is a very important one. This is what protects you. It's called a protection period. If your listing expired and one of the buyers you maybe spoke with or showed the property or had helped entice to the deal while you had the listing comes back a couple days right after the listing has closed out and they want to buy it, you have a right in those scenarios to be compensated. There's a couple stipulations to it, but it helps protect you. We generally want to see this around 90 days, 30 days at the lower end, 180 is starting to get pretty high. But a 60-90 day is a pretty common date to see in there. Helps protect us to make sure we can get paid even after the listing's over because we put all this effort in to get it drawn up. The example we give for that will be, hey, I had the listing up to January 1st, and on January 4th, Johnny had gotten my flyer 4 months earlier, now comes around and says, hey, I'd like to buy that place. It gives us a right to come back and work to get compensated for it. Brokerage relationship disclosure, always make sure that we made sure we give the buyer or seller that real estate brokerage relationship form. It doesn't have to be signed by them, but they do have to get it every time, and then it discloses how we work as a seller agent, buyer's agent, or a transaction broker. Now we're going to get into some of the agency pieces. So looking right at transaction broker, this gives an extra explanation to what a transaction broker is and making sure the seller is okay with that. Now know that as the listing agent, and you're listing the property, the brokerage will need to operate as a transaction brokerage. That is how we are structured. So you'll need to get a yes for this one to allow to make sure the seller is okay with the brokerage operating as a transaction broker. Because if I am operating as the broker for the property and you're listing it, we may have one of our agents who wants to buy it. So we need me in a transaction brokerage capacity, which we'll talk about here in a second. So designated agency. And if they want to mark no, it's not one where we just say we can't do the deal. We just need to make sure we talk through and work out what that looks like. But a yes is our most common response to that. Designated agency. This is one where we want to make sure we're able to appoint certain members to be a representative for the seller. So First part here, we're saying if a designated agent is not appointed to represent the seller, we want to make sure that they know that the broker is going to operate as a transaction broker in these scenarios. And so that if we're also going to perform, it means that the designated agent, if they're not going to be appointed to represent seller, that the brokerage can still get a buyer's agent to represent a buyer. That is what paragraph 2 says for it. So we ideally want this one also marked as a yes if we're not going to represent them as a seller. Now, if we are going to have a designated agent represent the seller, then that is where we focus on section B. And this is where we're telling them, hey, who is going to be doing it? So you as the listing agent listing the home, this is the important one. So we want a yes saying, hey, they are okay that we are going to appoint a designated agent to represent the seller. And then that's where you have a yes down here in this section. And then we're going to put your name as the agent in this section here. And this is what allows us to say the broker is going to operate as a transaction broker, which means that we can also have a designated buyer's agent on the other side, but I'm going to represent you, seller, as your listing agent, which technically I'm going to be your designated listing seller's agent. That is what this section is. So it's a big one where we want yes in your name here. Next piece here, making sure that they're going to consent to the above person operating as that designated agent, and then also if they have to operate for the buy side. So making sure that for example, let's say you took the listing, you had your name in here, they accepted it, but then let's say you had a buyer come through the open house and they want to actually buy the property too, and it was someone that you were already helping look for homes and you had a buyer's agreement with them. This is where we tell folks, if I bring the buyer and they've signed a buyer agreement with me, then I would ideally like to represent both sides. Are you okay with that? And this is where we would want to mark a yes. If they say, we're not sure, we're comfortable with that, then you can mark that as a no and revisit it later at the time of it. And if you are at the time of, make sure you get that amended. The key is that you have a transaction broker addendum signed with the contract at that moment. So what that looks like is, let's say again, you have a client that you already are representing looking for buyers or for a home, or you met them and they signed a buyer's agreement, they come to your open house, or you signed a showing for them to come see a house that you have listed. If they put an offer in on it, if this is marked yes, it can allow you to operate as a transaction agent in it, so long as you get that transaction broker addendum signed. So we want to have that discussion up front here. Ideally, we get a yes on that one. And this is how we explain it, that, hey, if I happen to bring a buyer that I'm working with and they want to purchase a home, I want to ideally have the ability to work for both sides. I would be a transaction broker, which in that scenario, I can't disclose to them your numbers, but I also can't disclose their numbers to you. So would you be interested in me doing that? And then you can read the disclosures for more information on how a transaction broker works. An important one, we want to make sure ideally is a yes, but if not, you can always revisit it at a future time if needed. Next is the home buyer protection plan. Typically in our environment right now, it's been a no, but if we're going to enter more of a seller's market, it's something that sometimes you might want to say, hey, let's say yes and let's offer a home warranty, because sometimes that helps cover the buyer's concerns about, are there any issues with the home? Oh, I have a 1-year home warranty. It's okay if there's maybe some issues with the house because we have some coverage. So sometimes it's a good thing that can help sell the home, and we might start seeing the need for that more so now. We're coming out of a very strong buyer's or seller's market as of this video recording. We might start seeing the buyers have a little more control, and that might help sell the home a little easier in the near future. But also still very good in the seller's market as well, just for, again, helping give that peace of mind to maybe I shouldn't say mitigate inspections, but make it a little easier to handle inspections. All right, the last parts here are making sure that it's more disclosure items and marketing pieces. We want to make sure this next 2 blanks that we understand if they are not a non-resident or are a non-resident. Think of it this way. Is not a non-resident is a double negative. So generally that means they're a U.S. citizen and they are a resident here. Is a non-resident means, okay, they are not a resident for the U.S. income taxing purposes, so we need to know. We need to know this mainly for titles so they can start getting different paperwork together. It's perfectly fine if they're not a resident. is a non-resident for the U.S. It just means title has to do a little bit different work. And if they're not, then we need to make sure that we just know that and we keep moving forward. So make sure it's filled out properly, ask the question, allows us to put it in the MLS. This part here, we want to make sure we get a yes because it allows us to distribute the information on this listing to as broadly as possible. So as it literally just says there, they acknowledge that distributing information is intended to increase public awareness of the property. Yes, we want them to know that. However, if they want to restrict us for certain things, they can tell us what they would not like. They do not want us to put it on any websites. They do not want to authorize display address on the internet website. Again, NA or 000 if that's one that we're going to just keep and not have to do these. Ideally, they do not answer yes to any of these, and we want to be able to market it to the broadest scope. But sometimes folks have concerns and they want to make sure that it's not in certain places, and we want to respect that. So that's why it's on here and we ask those questions. One of the last pieces here is 16 miscellaneous, but a very important section. If there's anything unique to the listing agreement, you want to put that in here. For example, if you're taking a listing and they said, well, if my kids want to buy it, I don't want to pay commission. That's the kind of stuff that goes in here. That being said, comments like that, you want to address those up front. So often you want to take a listing, if you're going to spend money and time, very valuable time, to take this listing, you want to make sure that you're going to get compensated for it if you bring a buyer. So if someone was to say, oh, there's a particular buyer, if they want to buy, I don't want to have to pay you. A typical response that we'll give to that is wonderful. We completely understand that. How about we reach out to them and we want to make sure that they're okay that we're able to list this and that you guys have cleared up if they're going to buy it from you now or not. Because here's the thing I want to make sure is if we start marketing this property, that person that told you no, they might get a little more enticed when all of a sudden they see our nice marketing, when they see us getting interest in the property from other people. And all of a sudden there's a little bit of that fear of missing out and they come back to you. I would argue that a good part of that for them coming around to want to buy is possibly due to our efforts and what we've done. So we want to make sure we're compensated. Therefore, that's where I really like to ask you, would you just please reach out to them, confirm they are going to want to purchase or not purchase before we move forward? Because I would like to keep this listing agreement as clean as possible, so I am working hard for you, because that is what we do. And just make sure it's cleared out. Most cases, they'll be okay with that, and they sign the agreement. You can maybe put in here, if Johnny wants to buy by a certain date, then there's no commission. This is just in that scenario, for example. But we wanted to try to have as clear of a listing agreement as possible without too many caveats. The last parts here are really just contractual agreements. They know it's signed electronically. That's an agreement. It's binding. It is a contract. I always let folks know here, hey, there's a binding effect. So this really is like a contract. We say agreement, but it's a legally binding agreement. So it's really a contract that we have together. Then everybody signs up. We want to make sure that we have the right address and everything in for us. We put Hearthstone Realty at top. Your information is the agent. We get all the sellers on here. The main thing here is to make sure that we have the seller's signature, and we'll make sure we have a couple points of their contact just in case. So that is the residential listing agreement. Very simple 5 pages lined out. Hopefully this gives you some good information to go forth and conquer. Take care. Bye-bye.